Welcome back to another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast. Mr. Orr, it has been a long time, I think almost 2 years probably since your first discussion on here where you kind of covered your little project that you had going on that was going to kind of rival the single bullet theory or the Dale Myers interpretation of the single bullet theory. Would you mind introducing yourself to everyone out there listening?
Thank you for having me back. Yes, I was on about 2 years ago, and I am the senior Justice Department official who got Janet Reno to reopen the JFK investigation back in the 1990s. I did this as a personal project outside of my Department of Justice work, where I studied the gunshots in Dealey Plaza and submitted a report of my findings. Janet Reno reopened the JFK investigation for further testing, and that testing reveal important new information. Since the mid 1990s, I've done a tremendous amount of additional research and has opened a lot of new doors for me about what happened beyond Dealey Plaza, which was beyond the scope of my initial project. But in doing that project, I had to read virtually everything I could find to find the things about Dealey Plaza within those reference sources. So I have read many thousands of pages about who might have been behind the assassination and how it was carried out. And I think we can focus on that mostly today.
Can I ask your opinion on who you think was behind the assassination?
The Mafia. I can say that with, I think, complete confidence now. There is a mountain of both circumstantial and direct evidence, as well as confessions, direct confessions by at least four of the key participants. So, to put a finer point on it, Carlos Marcello was the main planner for the assassination. He provided resources. He used his partner in crime, Santo Trapacante, the Tampa boss, to provide resources and planning. Sam Giancana also played a role. But Dallas, Texas was one of the jewels in Carlos Marcello's mafia crown in his territory based in New Orleans. And he had almost total control of the law enforcement community there and to some extent the geographic area where the assassination took place. So, yes, we could talk about that in much greater detail, but no doubt in my mind that the mafia was behind the assassination.
What would give him reason, Carlos Marcello or some any of the mob figures, to want to pull the hit on Kennedy? Obviously, we know a list of things that go back to I think even Kennedy Sr. When it came to some of the connections with that, but the HSCA obviously investigated this area, and I think they proved or had the conclusion that they had the motive and means to be able to conclude something into the Kennedy assassination. But I think it comes from Frank Regana, who talks about the testimonies of certain mob individuals giving like a dying kind of statement or something like that.
Yeah, it goes back. I guess the key first event was April 1961. Carlos Marcello was a Sicilian of Sicilian parents. He happened to be born in Tunisia, which was just across the water from Sicily, but he was Sicilian. When he came to the U.S. illegally, he's an illegal immigrant, and he had a forged birth certificate from Guatemala. And Bobby Kennedy, when he became Attorney General, was conducting a very successful effort basically to wipe the mob out. He greatly increased the resources dedicated to that within the department and was having a great deal of success in prosecuting mobsters. Well, Carlos Marcello was one of his main targets. And in April 1961, when Marcello was on the way to check in with immigration because of his immigrant status, he was seized off the street of New Orleans without so much as a toothbrush and basically deported with questionable legality, probably illegal deportation by Bobby Kennedy, and flown to Guatemala, which is kind of a joke because Kennedy knew he was Sicilian, but that he had faked a Guatemalan birth certificate. So he says, well, if you're Guatemala, I'm going to take you back there. And he dropped him in the jungle in Guatemala basically to die with his fancy clothes on that he wore in New Orleans. He somehow made his way through the jungle and had some pretty serious injuries in the process, but he wound up crossing the line into Honduras. And there is documentary evidence, and it's logical to believe that his personal pilot, David Ferry, who will factor in throughout this very prominently, David Ferry, his personal pilot, came to Guatemala or Honduras and flew him back out home. He laid low for a while, but then felt comfortable in surfacing again. And then the deportation process continued by Bobby Kennedy for some time after that. So, based on that experience, Carlos Marcello hated Bobby Kennedy, hated the Kennedy family for what they did to him, and never lost that hate until he died. Uh, then you fast forward a little bit. Jimmy Hoffa is being prosecuted by Bobby Kennedy, and his whole organization is under attack by the Justice Department. Hoffa starts telling Trafficante and Marcello, you got to do something about this guy. He's going to put us all out of business. The mob does not like to go after public figures. It draws too much attention. But if you go back to Sicily, the mob in Sicily has the same practice, but if they find it necessary to put a hit on a public figure or uh, a politician, they get some patsy, some idiot, drunk guy, whatever, to take the blame for it. They pretty much wrap up a package of evidence against that person and lead the authorities to him. And that's the way they get away with it because they know the public is going to demand a solution to the crime. It won't be left unsolved. So they give them a solution. And so in the fall of 1962, after being deported and still hating the Kennedys, Jimmy Hoffa, Santo Trafficante, and Marcello realized that if this goes on much longer, the mob is going to be out of business. So they take the drastic step of deciding they have to kill Kennedy. In the fall of 62 or late summer of 62, we don't know the exact date, Marcello on his 6,400 acre farm, Churchill Farm, in the swamps of outside New Orleans, had a meeting with three other associates. And he said that Kennedy's going to be killed, meaning John Kennedy. There's going to be a hit put out on him. And he said, not Bobby, because if you want to kill the dog, you don't cut off the tail, which is Bobby. You cut off the head, which is John. So that was the plan. And all of the circumstantial evidence is that around February of 1963, just a few months after this meeting, he put the plan into action. He recruited Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, Oswald grew up on the edge of the Marcello organization. This is something that's so obvious and so documentary that the public doesn't know about. It's hard to believe. But Oswald's father died before Oswald was born. The person who raised him as a surrogate father was Dutch Moret. He lived in the Moret household for some time. Dutch Moret was a major bookmaker head for operation of Carlos Marcello in New Orleans. That's documented. Oswald's mother, Marguerite, knew Marcello's chauffeur well, knew his lawyer well. Um, David Ferry, who was personal pilot for Marcello and later a private investigator in the deportation cases for Marcello, was the squadron head for Lee Oswald's Civil Air Patrol Squadron. We have a photo of them standing together at a squadron outing. So all of these connections and more, I haven't barely scratched the surface on the connections between Oswald and Marcello, meant that he would be a perfect patsy recruit to take the blame for the assassination. And that was set in place around February of 63. And in the spring, that same season, spring of 63, we don't know the exact date, but a Savannah businessman named Gene Sumner, after the assassination, came forward to the FBI and said, hey, I was in Carlos Marcello's headquarters, the Town and Country Motel, a sleazy motel out by the airport. He kept a low profile. So uh, Sumner was in the restaurant of this headquarters motel, and he saw the manager of the restaurant sitting in a booth with Lee Harvey Oswald and handing a big wad of cash under the table to him. So this all starts fitting together that beginning in February and throughout the spring, he is Oswald and Marcello are sowing the breadcrumbs, which later will lead back to Oswald being the killer. He bought the rifle by mail order. He bought the pistol by mail order, leaving a long paper trail of those purchases. He had Marina stage the photo of him holding the rifle and the pistol in the communist newspapers, which he didn't even subscribe to. He just got a trial subscription free so he could hold it up. Everything about Oswald that is communist is a sham. When you look in his inner life, he believed in the American system. He didn't like the Russian system. We can get into that later. That's a whole other can of worms. But he started creating this sham image of him being a communist out for retribution or to get political figures. And all throughout the spring of 1963, he was creating this impression, including the attempted, in quotes, murder of General Walker, which is another story, which I believe was part of this sham. Oswald, as a great recruit for Marcello, had all the characters he wanted, except he didn't have a history for violence. And I believe the Oswald alleged attempted murder of Walker was staged to create that record of proclivity for violence. So in the spring, they're doing all this. Now, keep in mind, Oswald was a knowing recruit. I don't think a willing recruit. If you know, if you grew up around Carlos Marcello and you know what he's capable of, and he tells you you're going to do this, you know you're dead, or your family's dead, or both if you don't do it. So he was recruited, probably unwillingly at first, probably promised a lot of cash, which I'll get to later. But he was a willing and knowing participant, or at least a knowing participant, maybe somewhat willing. Um, and he is sowing these seeds, laying out these breadcrumbs throughout the months before November 63, so that it would be easy for ultimately the Warren Commission to put the pieces together, making him appear guilty. In the summer, from April until September, he actually moves to New Orleans, where he can easily and conveniently communicate with the other participants who are all based there. In the center of that planning was Guy Bannister's office in New Orleans. Guy Bannister was the former head of the FBI in Chicago who had a drinking problem and who degenerated in very erratic and dangerous behavior. So he was a private investigator in New Orleans. He worked for Carlos Marcello as a private investigator. But his office, small two-story building, was the headquarters in the summer of 63 for the main participants. That would be Guy Bannister, David Ferry, Lee Harvey Oswald, two Cubans from upstairs, the same little two-story building. There was an anti-Castro operation and an office upstairs from that. And that office address was 544 Camp Street. When Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested on the streets of New Orleans, passing out pro Castro literature, which again was a sham. That was designed to provoke a fight with anti Castro people, which it did. Oswald was arrested. He was bailed out by one of Carlos Marcello's top lieutenants. But on some of the handbills that he passed out in that sequence was a stamped address at the bottom, 544 Camp Street. So the two Cubans who were in that office at that address worked with Bannister, Ferry, Oswald in planning the assassination. There were Sergio Arcacha Smith and Emilio Santana. So those are key participants in the assassination that were planning. And Oswald had the opportunity to go where he wanted in New Orleans that whole summer. He could go out to Churchill Farms and meet with Marcello if he needed to. And we have Marcello's own statements that he did that he met with Oswald several times. So all this is going on in the summer of 63. And then Oswald takes the trip to Mexico, allegedly trying to get into Cuba and then Russia. That, again, in my opinion, my conclusion, that was a sham. He had no intention of going to either place. If you're Carlos Marcello and the mob is about to be put out of business and you have to take the drastic step of killing a president, you want the blame to be placed on somebody else, specifically beyond your Patsy Oswald, specifically your enemies. Who are Carlos Marcello's enemies? The federal government, who's putting him out of business, and Fidel Castro, who closed Trafficante and Marcello's casinos, costing them millions of dollars, continued to operate the casinos by the government of Cuba, but not giving the mobsters any money. So they lost a ton of money with that. So their enemy was to get Castro out of power and to get the federal government off of their back. So Oswald is the perfect recruit for that. He has direct and serious ties with the U.S. intelligence community. Another long story, but I can say with confidence that Oswald was tied to the U.S. intelligence community. So he wants to point the blame toward the U.S. through Oswald's connection there, and the trip to Cuba, trip to Mexico to allegedly go to Cuba, was to point the finger at Castro, and that worked to some extent. A lot of the conjecture early on was that Castro was involved, and the conjecture still today is that the CIA was involved. So Marcello was a criminal genius. He was dropped out of school in elementary school, ninth grade, but he's only about 5 feet tall, but he was a tough, brutal murderer who had a criminal mind unexcelled. So his planning was very clever, and he knew how to orchestrate the system to direct it to his enemies rather than to him. And he felt comfortable that in Dallas, Texas, he had virtually every key law enforcement person on his payroll. He bragged about it. Throughout his empire, he did that. He spent a fortune on keeping judges, coroners, police officers, sheriffs on his payroll. So he felt that he knew enough people, and enough people in the Dallas law enforcement community owed him, that he could commit a crime there and probably get away with it.
Now, I want to go back to a couple things you said, but anywhere that you look in the case, obviously, you have to acknowledge the mafia aspect. Not as you don't have to make the conclusion that they were behind it, but you can look and just see where things were investigated that had interesting connections. And one thing that I found out about 9 months ago was that Charles Dutz Moret had a connection to Carlos Marcello. And if you looked at when Oswald got arrested, I think it was the fight with Carlos Bernier. A lot of stuff gets told about an FBI agent, or he asked to speak to an FBI agent, and someone came down there, and then people, I guess, just assume that Oswald was let out by the FBI agent. That's not true, because in the testimony, when they talked with Charles Dutz Moret, they talked to, I think, his daughter or someone, because Moret was gone at the time, so he had no idea that Oswald even got locked up. But he goes, how did the situation get fixed? And she said, oh, we pulled a connection and got Oswald out. So I'm assuming they mean the connection meaning something to do with Carlos Marcello, like you had mentioned.
Correct. Yes, it was a associate of Melchior Picoro, one of Carlos's top people, came to bail out Oswald.
Now, I made a clip on this, so I'm going to share it real quick, and we can just play it just for visual and people who are new to this. It has the testimony of Dutz Moret in here, and then also the one after this is Clem Sert, which I believe is the lawyer that you were mentioning that knew Margaret pretty well, because he was also interviewed in the same aspect. But let's just play this real quick.
Dutz Moret was the uncle of Lee Harvey Oswald and was involved in the New Orleans underworld, particularly in gambling circles associated with organized crime. Moret was a bookmaker and worked for years in an illegal gambling syndicate affiliated with the Carlos Marcello crime family. He had close associations with Sam Saya, a prominent organized crime figure in New Orleans, known for his illegal gambling operations and connections to the Marcello family. Throughout Oswald's life, he maintained a close relationship with the Morets, particularly during his childhood and adolescence. Oswald frequently visited his aunt and uncle's home and even stayed with them during various periods of his life. When Oswald was arrested in New Orleans for handing out leaflets, Moret was out of town and when he returned was informed of the arrest. It was mentioned that Oswald was released by a friend of Moret who was called by his daughter Joyce. Despite Moret's involvement in illegal activities, This aspect of his life was not thoroughly investigated by the Warren. Charles Dutt.
Would you say that's a fair assessment, that clip?
Yes, I would. Yes.
Okay. That was my clip, by the way. So I'm on the right track on this one. Now, this one's Clem Sayre. I believe this was the lawyer. This was the lawyer. This was the lawyer that I believe you were mentioning.
An associate lawyer and a financial advisor to a Louisiana banker associated with Carlos Marcello. When Mrs. Marguerite Oswald testified to the Warren Commission, she explained she had known Clem and his family for years since early childhood. Mrs. Oswald admitted to not seeing him for years until she sought legal help in her son's desire to join the Marines and falsify his birth certificate, since at the time he was underage. At first, Clem denied in helping Lee join the Marines, but then eventually agreed to falsifying documents so he could join early. This was found out by the Marines, and he was rejected when trying to enlist. On December 7, 1978, an associate of Clem stated that Clem came forward before his death that he had been contacted by some party at the time of the assassination to head down to Dallas and represent the accused assassin, which Clem did not discuss further.
So I think, obviously, the Marcello angle, it's there. They investigated it briefly. They didn't go full depth probably into it on certain aspects. I don't know, but it's much like with Jack Ruby's phone records. I mean, if it wasn't for Burt Griffith, we wouldn't have those records even in the whole statements from the HSCA conclusions as well either. So we get a lot here. Obviously, we hear the mob theory come out, but I just wanted to show those clips because you can't find that. I did not know that was in there. I was digging through testimony, and I found that on like page 10,000 of whatever I was on looking through the Warren Commission volume. So I think it was important that a lot of people totally don't know about that area about Oswald's life, that there was this connection to the Marcello family.
Yeah, on that point, the Warren Commission wore the world's largest set of blinders when they were conducting their investigation. A 10-year-old could have figured out that when Ruby killed Oswald, the first thing you want to look at is, did he do it to silence him? And when you start looking at that, the roommate of Jack Ruby, George Senator, told the Warren Commission investigators, they asked him, who are the three closest friends to Jack Ruby in the world? One of them was Wally Weston, his master of ceremonies at the Carousel Club. The other two were Mafia, Ralph Paul and Joe Campisi Jr. The Warren Commission knew this. It was in their files. Their investigators were told that the number two man in the Dallas Mafia at the time, Joe Campisi, and his partner, I have the FBI report where Joe Campisi told the FBI that Ralph Paul was his partner, Campisi's partner. Those two were the two closest friends in the world to Jack Ruby. Ralph Paul was the legal owner of half of the Carousel Club. Jack Ruby did not own any of it. He was a paid employee. He was a low-level mafia employee who ran the Carousel Club and did a number of other things for the Marcello organization. But a 10-year-old could have followed that trail better than the Warren Commission did. They put the blinders on, and they had a political reason for doing that, and that was to prevent World War III. Nicholas Katzenbach and Lyndon Johnson and J. Edgar Hoover all said, you got to shut this down as quickly as possible and convince the public that this is a lone nut and that nobody else was involved. Otherwise, it could lead to Cuba or Russia and start World War III. So that political mandate from Lyndon Johnson to Earl Warren guided the entire investigation and kept them from looking into things that a 10-year-old could have figured out in a couple of hours.
Do you believe they would have honestly examined the mob angle if they weren't felt like they were pressured so much to get their report out within a certain amount of time to convince the public that it was Lee Harvey Oswald?
Yeah, I don't think it was getting the report out. It was just getting the word out to the public. They took a long time to get the report out because it was so.
It was 10 months. It should have been longer.
Yeah. But to get the word out within a few days before all the gossip and rumors went crazy, to convince the public, hey, settle down. This is just a lone nut, no problem. So, yeah, that governed everything that the Warren Commission did and prevented a real investigation. When you're investigating the mafia, you don't go out, as the Warren Commission did, and ask a mafia member, did you have anything to do with this? And they say no, and you walk away and go to somebody else. That's not how you conduct a mafia investigation.
When do you think that their hand was forced, I guess, to examine certain things when it came to like the whole statistic, like Jack Ruby shooting Oswald? I mean, we have one of the biggest motives that went out there was that Jack Ruby had patriotic dignity to go shoot Oswald, and that's why it happened. He wanted to spare Jackie Kennedy the time to going to a funeral or dealing with a trial or something like that. But even the Warren Commission didn't believe that. It's like in a clip I have with J. Lee Rankin when he was asked about Jack Ruby's motives, and he even acknowledges that he doesn't believe that the Warren Commission felt so comfortable that that was the answer.
Yeah, you have to be pretty naive and believe in fairy tales to buy that one. Jack Ruby was a bum. He was a hoodlum. He didn't have a noble bone in his body. He had no, according to almost all of his associates who were asked, he had no political interest at all, except like Carlos Marcello, he disliked Bobby Kennedy. But as far as politics and John Kennedy, he never talked about it, had no interest in it. So when he starts ranting and raving in the Dallas Morning News and crying about how horrible that, how much he loved John Kennedy, again, that's staged. Um, and for this bum who didn't have a noble bone in his body to say, I'm going to sacrifice my life so that Jackie Kennedy won't have to come to Texas and testify in a trial, that's beyond nonsense. He had other very good reasons for doing what he did, and we can get into that at more length too.
I'd like to because I just want to know what the whole Jack Ruby connection. I know we mentioned in your first episode a little bit at the end about Jack Ruby, and I think I mentioned some things and you had mentioned some things. We were going to do an episode on it. It just took us 2 years to get there. But what you said about Jack Ruby was the exact opinion that Jack Revel gave to the HSCA. I'm going to play the clip for you real quick just so you can see it. But it brings up the question, which was asked, and I have that clip as well too, was that wouldn't this be the perfect person to be someone connected to the mob? Because what Jack Revel explains in this clip, he calls him a buffoon. And the guy asked the question, wouldn't that be a perfect person to be like a bag man or something like that? But I'm going to play the clip.
Did you know Jack Ruby personally?
Yes, sir. I've known Jack Ruby since 1953.
What was the nature of your relationship with Jack Ruby?
No relationship whatsoever other than a professional relationship, a police officer to an individual such as Jack Ruby.
Did you ever visit any of his clubs?
I was in one club in 1953, the old Silver Spur Club in South Dallas, and that was the only occasion I was ever in one of his clubs.
What was your personal impression of Jack Ruby?
Jack Ruby was a buffoon. And I would say this to this committee. If Jack Ruby was a member of organized crime, then the personnel director of organized crime ought to be replaced.
Why do you say that, Captain Revel?
Knowing Jack Ruby to be a buffoon.
Was your impression of Jack Ruby shared by other members of the Dallas Police Department?
It was shared by members of my intelligence unit.
So, again, they asked him the question, if you think Jack Ruby's a buffoon, wouldn't that be a perfect person to be connected with some type of organized crime? And I think a lot of people bring up that he was either low level, and this is where we can kind of decipher how deep that connection was. Because I do believe that it was either the Dallas police or someone had gotten Jack Ruby into that basement to kill Lee Harvey Oswald, because I didn't feel like they wanted any of this to go to trial, because I think a lot of things were going to be uncovered.
Okay, let me take a little detour, and then we'll come back to it. Carlos Marcello was the victim of two undercover operations. One was Bry Lab in around 1980, late 70s, 1980, where Joseph Hauser was pressured into becoming an undercover informant, and hundreds of hours of tape were made of Marcello during the Bry Lab investigation. Then about 5 years later, in 1985-86, another undercover investigation, Camtex, took place when Carlos, late in his life, was in federal prison camp. And the FBI pressured another guy, Jack Van Lanningham, who was in trouble for, he was otherwise a good guy, but he got in trouble with some bank issues. But they felt that he was about Marcello's age and was the perfect one to befriend him. So they arranged for him to be the cellmate of Carlos Marcello. This is, again, late in Marcello's life, and he's kind of looking back on his career. but they became cellmates, and they put a recorder in an old transistor radio that they gave Van Lanningham. And again, hundreds of hours of tape were recorded. And during both of those undercover operations, Brylab and Camtex, Carlos Marcello made incriminating confessions about his role in the assassination. To Joseph Hauser, he said, "Yeah, I knew Lee Harvey Oswald. He worked for me in the summer of '63." And I think he mentioned Sam Saya, which was mentioned in one of your clips, a leading bookmaker head in New Orleans. Sam Saya, one of Marcello's guys, mentioned him in context of um, Oswald working for Saya. So then in the Camtex investigation, there is a virtual treasure trove of admissions by Marcello. Unfortunately, both of those tapes, hundreds of hours of tapes in both of those investigations, are still sealed, as far as I know, by the federal government. One of the partners who you've had on your show twice, one of the partners in my current JFK project, recreating Dealey Plaza, is Larry Schnapp. And he is one of the two lawyers who is suing the federal government to get full disclosure of all JFK records. And I asked Larry to specifically include in that suit getting the Camtex and Brylab tapes finally released to the public so we can hear them. But for hundreds of hours, Marcello, who befriended Van Lanningham, trusted him and liked him, pretty much opened up to him about his organization. And we have many confessions, but in the course of that, he told Van Lanningham that Jack Ruby worked for him in Dallas, that he put him up in business in a strip club. And we found out through other records that Carlos Marcello's organization was the actual owner of the Carousel Club. Ruby had no ownership interest in it. He was just an employee. So he put him up in business in these various clubs in town, and he made him the payoff guy for law enforcement in Dallas. Marcello says this to Van Lanningham multiple times, and that he would come to Marcello, would bring Ruby to the Churchill Farms 6,400 acre swampy estate that Marcello owned in New Orleans area to meet with him and obviously talk about paying off law enforcement. So there we have from Marcello's own mouth. And by the way, the FBI and federal judges found Van Lanningham to be highly credible and highly reliable with his information. Nothing he ever said, to my knowledge, was proved to be false. So we have from Marcello's own mouth that Ruby was a low-level operative of his in Dallas, not a made man. He was Jewish. He was not in the mob. But this is the atmosphere that we plot the assassination down in. And you mentioned getting into the basement to shoot Oswald. The only way the public could just walk in, if they were allowed to, would be down the ramp to the basement. At least 3 Dallas police officers swore that nobody came down that ramp, and they're certain they all knew Jack Ruby, of course. Jack Ruby knew hundreds of Dallas law enforcement people on a first name basis, so they all knew him. They said he did not come down there, period. Of course, the Warren Commission chose to disregard that highly convincing evidence. But in fact, we'll never know for sure, but it's very likely that he was let in through a side door off the alley into the basement. And there is some evidence that Sergeant Patrick Dean, who was in charge of basement security that morning, is the one who let him in. Apparently, Patrick Dean flunked a lie detector test when he was asked about that.
Well, they never found the lie detector results. He said he passed it, but when they went to subpoena for it, or when they went to go for it for the HSCA, they couldn't find the polygraph records for the test that he was talking about. Also, Patrick Dean was later discovered, it was through Jack Revel's HSCA interview, that he removed 2 guards off one of the side doors 30 minutes before the transfer was about to happen. This is where Jack Revel was asked about Ruby getting access to the Oswald transfer. Is there another possible way he could have went down? And then Jack Revel explains that there is a building side right that's like right beside where he could have been let in through this door if it was unlocked and went down there. But at the time when Jack Revel was asked this, he was found out very later on that Dean had removed these guards from that door. But no damage was done. Like nobody was, fired. Nobody was, punished or anything like that. He admitted to that. So
Yeah, that's the most likely result. We'll never know for sure. But the point is, you didn't just wander into the basement that day. As Ruby, again, the fairy tale that he was so emotional, he just found himself in the basement. That's just nonsense.
he was there all weekend. He was literally dressed up as a reporter.
He was stalking Oswald with his gun in his pocket from the first moment that he got there. And that leads into another big point that we should address, and that is even those people who accept that the mafia was behind this, they tend to think that Ruby was only recruited to kill Oswald after Tippit was shot and Oswald was arrested. I say that's wrong. There is a world of evidence that Jack Ruby was involved in the assassination before that. He was not recruited at the last minute. And it's my opinion, based on what I think is convincing circumstantial evidence, that he was the on site coordinator for the assassination. He, like Oswald, has the benefit of being close enough to the Marcello organization that they can be controlled, but far enough away that there's plausible deniability. And it was successful. Somehow Ruby wanted through all this and not being identified by the Warren Commission as a mob operative. It's just unbelievable. So um, you go back to Ruby changing his behavior before the assassination. He was always out of money. He carried large wads of cash around with him from the club all the time, dangerously. But that was Marcello's cash. Ruby himself was always broke. He lived in a sleazy, lower middle income apartment. He had no obvious means to buy anything of value. He was about 200,000 or more dollars in today's money in debt to the IRS. Hadn't paid his taxes. He was in a world of trouble. The circumstantial evidence is that because he was so deep in debt, he started skimming off the Carousel Club profits, and that Carlos Marcello discovered that and called him to Churchill Farm to tell him he was aware of it. And that probably, again, this is circumstantial, we can't be certain, but that possibly, if not probably, was when he was recruited to be the on site coordinator for the assassination. Um, a number of people testified that Ruby and Oswald were seen together in the weeks before the assassination. Warren Commission again dismissed it. I don't know if it's true or not. To me, that's the last thing they would want to do. Jack Ruby was never supposed to submerge, uh, uh, come up above water in this thing. Um, he was to be underground and pulling the strings, but not to be known by the public to be involved. That all changed when Tippit was murdered. So the plan was for Ruby to pull the strings and to contact Oswald surreptitiously, but I don't think they would have had him come to the club. They may have gotten careless once or twice, but I doubt that. I think the plan was to keep the two of them separate publicly. But I will noted another possibility, against circumstantial evidence. Oswald lived in two boarding houses in the weeks before the assassination. Both of those bordered on a huge wooded park called Oak Cliff. They were both a very short walk to Oak Cliff Park. Jack Ruby's apartment was just a few minutes away from Oak Cliff Park. If they had wanted to, and Oswald had a payphone in his rooming house, if they had wanted to, they could have arranged by phone to meet at night in the woods in Oak Cliff Park and never be noticed. Again, that's speculation, but it makes some sense. So there were ways for the two of them to communicate. without being seen.
I want to play something you just said. So Gerald Ford was asked in the HSCA interviews about interviewing Jack Ruby, and also another thing you had mentioned is the clip right after this. But I'm going to play this real quick.
Mr. President, you and I think Chief Justice Warren went to Dallas and had an interview with Jack Ruby. Why was Ruby not taken to Washington for further questioning as he requested?
Chief Justice, the chairman of our commission, and myself, along with several staff members, thoroughly interrogated Jack Ruby in Dallas on that Sunday afternoon. We believe that we had fully probed all of the information that he had available. It is my best recollection that the other members of the commission agreed with the Chief Justice and myself that it was not necessary to bring Ruby from Dallas to Washington and to go through another interrogation of him.
Mr. President,
I'm going to play this one too.
I'm the only person in the background that knows the truth.
As the transcript indicates, Jack Ruby did request a polygraph examination. At his request, that was given, and the commission and the staff of the commission had the benefit of that polygraph and that interrogation. So when you brought it all together, the interrogation by the chairman and myself and the staff, plus the polygraph, it did not seem necessary to bring Jack Ruby down to Washington for further investigation or interrogation.
in other words, it was the feeling of the commission, or at least a majority of them, that no meaningful purpose would be served by transporting him from Dallas to Washington.
That is correct, sir.
So Gerald Ford was asked about his interviewing, and obviously if you read Ruby's statements, there's a lot there where he's saying over and over again, get me to Washington, I'm fearing for my family. Now you can look at it as maybe he thinks that someone's going to shut him up, which could be a possibility. I mean, the fact that I don't know what your opinion on that would be. I've always leaned more towards some kind of government stuff here, but if we're looking at it from a mafia aspect, could it be possible that Jack Ruby thought himself was going to be knocked off because of the actions of being arrested for shooting Oswald?
Absolutely. You have to remember that Ruby was the payoff man for law enforcement. So he knew exactly who in law enforcement was on the take because he was paying them. So he was incarcerated in Dallas law enforcement, and he knew which ones were working under the payroll of the mob. So he had every reason to fear for his life in the custody of Dallas law enforcement. Not only that, but his sister, Eva Grant, who worked with Ruby as a partner in several of the clubs. At the time, she was working in the office of Sheriff Bill Decker. So she was right under the nose of Dallas law enforcement. So he had every reason to fear for his family's safety as well. So yes, he wanted to go to Washington because he could not talk in Dallas. And he tried to tell them that in every way he could. And they wouldn't accept it for obvious reasons because of their predetermined political outcome that they wanted. And he mentioned the polygraph. The HSCA took about 3 pages to say how that polygraph was totally rigged. As I recall, the dials were turned down on that machine so low that it wouldn't have registered anything. J. Edgar Hoover had his own reasons to want to keep a lid on this thing and not to have it spread into the mafia. So J. Edgar Hoover sent an FBI agent down to conduct the polygraph. Who knows what instructions this agent was under, but according to experts in the HSCA, he badly botched that examination so that it wouldn't have read any lies on the machine.
I'm going to play this clip with Dealey Rankin. It's the clip I was mentioning about where was Oswald going at the time of the Tippit shooting.
Did you make any effort, either as a staff or to your knowledge as a commission, to determine just where Oswald was going at the time he was intercepted by Officer Tippit?
We speculated on it, but speculations weren't worth much.
Well, did you come to any reasonable hypothesis as to where he was going?
We all agreed that he was on his way to try to escape, but where, we didn't know. And
of course, I presume you were aware that the direction in which he was heading at the time that he was confronted by Tippit kind of led to nowhere with respect to either escape routes or anything, just out in the neighborhood.
Well, we didn't think that was really the complete answer, because at that point he was very hard pressed, and we thought he was more in the posture of just running.
Well, did you find out that Jack Ruby's apartment was about 2 or 3 blocks up the street on the direct route he was going?
Yes.
I like how he does the reluctant yes at the ending. There's obviously something there, but I think it brings up to a reasonable point. When anyone was really interviewed about Lee Harvey Oswald, or anyone had information on Lee Harvey Oswald, the question was usually asked if there was any type of connection with Jack Ruby, or did they ever meet each other? And a lot of people said no. I only found a few people like Bill DeMar, who I can play that clip if you'd like, when he's on air talking about that he saw Jack Ruby there. But all the carousel girls said that Lee Harvey Oswald never went there, and the lights were too bright on the stage anyway, where it was really hard to tell, even if he was. So, I mean, it makes it more confusing, but obviously this is a problem for the Warren Commission, because Lee Harvey Oswald cannot know Jack Ruby. Now, a lot of people bring up in the photograph, the famous one where Lee Harvey Oswald is getting shot in the gut, is that when he was looking over, he recognized Jack Ruby, and that's why his face looks like that. I don't necessarily believe it, but obviously this is something you have to kind of acknowledge when you're going through much of the case. There is these questions that get brought up. Did Jack Ruby know Oswald? Did they ever hang out together? Did they do this in combination together? Because with Jack Ruby, he's all over the place. He's all over Dallas Police Headquarters. He's all over that whole weekend. He's all over Dealey Plaza. He's everywhere where there's very suspicious things. He's at Parkland Hospital when JFK gets brought there. Now, is he nosy? I believe that, sure. But there's obviously a lot of things that the Warren Commission chose not to pursue. Seth Kanner's our main voice when it comes to him being seen at Parkland Hospital. There is another witness there. I think her name's Bertha Lozano, who states seeing Jack Ruby there. But this was not an area that was pressed. It was denied that Jack Ruby was at Parkland Hospital when JFK was brought there. So I'm curious, in your mind, when it comes to the connection between Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about the grand plan, because obviously there is a document I do believe that a lot of people have probably seen, which talks about going to see the fireworks. This was a statement that Jack Ruby allegedly said on the day of the assassination. Now, we know there were no fireworks at all during that parade thing. We know people heard what sounded like firecrackers until they realized they were gunshots. But we also know that, from what I believe, Jack Ruby went to the Dallas Morning News building and was sitting by a window that basically overlooked the shooting spot of JFK. And he was sitting in, I think that's confirmed by multiple people that were in the Dallas Morning News office. They talked about Jack Ruby sitting at people's desks and was very frantic, and then kind of looked shocked when the news and everything kind of happened. So maybe we can kind of address the Jack Ruby Oswald connection, your just thoughts on it, not if you have a significant definitive answer, and then we can go to the plan part where we talk about the Dallas Morning News building and Jack Ruby's kind of being there.
Okay, yeah. As I said before, I don't put a lot of stock in people that say they openly met. That goes against the plan completely, because Ruby was part of the pre-planning. I think the local coordinator, but definitely in some aspect, he was part of the pre-planning. And it would be against the mafia. They know how to conduct hits, and it would be against the mafia to do something stupid like have them socialize in public. So, yes, they had to communicate. They could have done it through the payphone in the boarding house, and they could have had surreptitious meetings, as I speculated, as far as Oak Cliff Park. So they did have to get together. They did have to communicate, but I don't think they would have been stupid enough to have him come to the club. Now, in any plan, there are gaffes, there are mistakes, and it's possible that once they slipped up and somebody saw them, but I don't know which of those accounts to say is credible, and that's the one time they might have gotten together. So I assume they didn't get together in public, and that was for a very good reason. And then you go to the pre-planning by Ruby, and 7 years ago it was released with a document dump that the informant said on the morning of the 22nd, Ruby said, "You want to go down to Dealey Plaza with me and watch the fireworks?" Um, as you point out, he was sitting in front of the only window at the Dallas Morning News where you could see the school book depository and Dealey Plaza clearly, watching the assassination as it took place. He was in charge of this thing. He had to make sure it was carried out. And Seth Cantor and another witness, Seth Cantor knew Ruby well, stopped him trying to enter the side of Parkland Hospital, a side entrance, ran into him and said, "What are you doing here?" They had a conversation. Inexplicably, the Warren Commission just disregarded that. Seth Cantor was a very reliable reporter, and another witness saw Ruby there as well. Well, the reason Ruby was there was because it was his responsibility to kill Kennedy, and he tried to get into Parkland to get word from somebody there as to whether the guy was dead or not. That was his life path. He gets to live if he kills Kennedy. And that's the same reason when he shot Oswald that his jailer said he's nervous and walking around pacing. And the only time he relaxed was when I told him that Oswald was dead. That was because it was his job to kill Oswald, and Ruby felt he was a dead man if he didn't carry out the task. So those two deaths were critical to Oswald in surviving in the mafia.
I want to ask about, you said that Jack Ruby was there to get the confirmation that Kennedy was dead. A lot of people have theorized that Jack Ruby's the one that placed like a perfectly pristine bullet at Parkland Hospital.
That goes back to my first appearance on your podcast. The bullet that was found either on Connolly's stretcher or the stretcher immediately abutting it, I'm certain, and I stated in my report, fell out of Connolly's pants when they were taken off on the gurney. That bullet entered back end forward about a quarter inch into his thigh, his left thigh, and it stayed there until his pants were taken off and it pulled it loose and it fell out on the gurney. And the reason I know that is because the bullet has the perfect characteristics of the shot that was made with it. It had the damage, it had the uh, perfect nose, the dented base that would have come from the shot that, in fact, that bullet CE 399 had made. So anybody who plants a bullet in the hospital gurney would have no way of knowing how to ballistically match that with the other evidence. So there is no evidence that Ruby planted anything. I'm not aware of any evidence he actually made it far into the hospital. He was just trying to get in far enough to talk to somebody and say, "What's going on with the president?" I don't know if he ever got to ask that question or not, but he did try to get into the hospital. And the only logical reason that I know of that he would do that when all this stuff was going on, drive all the way over there, was to find out if his target had been killed.
Now, what would be his motive for shooting Oswald then? Wouldn't
Well,
Marcello be mad about that because Oswald technically works for him?
that's exactly it. You put your finger on it. If I'm correct, that Ruby was the on-site coordinator, it was responsibility to do the job properly. If something messes up, it's his responsibility to clean it up. So I am fairly certain in all those mob phone calls on the afternoon of November 22nd, um, acting as intermediary, some of those people to Marcello, the message was gotten back to him: "You screwed up. You didn't get Oswald out of town into Galveston. You got to fix this." So he starts stalking him immediately. And they knew that this was even more risky than killing the president. This would almost certainly, to any legitimate investigation, point the finger right at the mob. But they had to take that chance. That's why he stalks him, pretends to be a journalist the night of the assassination, standing up on a table with a journalistic steno pad, supposedly taking notes. And then when Henry Wade, the DA, says Oswald was a member of the Free Cuba Committee, Ruby pipes up from the back of the room, "No, Henry, it was a fair play for Cuba Committee." And the significance of that is Cuba Committee was an anti-Castro committee. And Ruby wanted to make sure the public got the word that it was a pro-Castro committee, in fact. So, number one, how did Ruby know the correct name of that thing in all this chaos? And number two, he had to take the chance of shouting out in this huge crowded room with reporters, exposing himself to correct the record to continue the premise that Marcello wanted to sell, that this was a pro-Castro assassination.
I'm gonna play these clips with Nicholas Katzenbach in his HSCA interviews where they asked, this first one's about being asked if Ruby, the organized crime aspect.
To ask if you could shed any light as to how you would have advised the FBI to proceed with the alleged connections between Jack Ruby and organized crime.
Well, I think it should have been explored in normal investigative ways. That is, they have some sources they have still use to some extent, electronic devices in appropriate circumstances, and I would have thought they would have made every effort that was possible to see what those connections were, if any. There's certainly a massive amount of data in the FBI with respect to organized crime. There even was at that time. I suspect there's a lot more today.
And then this one's about his phone calls.
There are recommendations here from these two junior attorneys on the Warren Commission. Their recommendation is really pretty precise, and it said that Mr. Rankin should address a letter to the chief executive of each of the telephone companies mentioned in paragraph 8, requesting that such companies not destroy until June 1st, 64, any records they may have with respect to telephone service of all subscribers. If you look earlier on in the document, you find they're suggesting that they survey any telephone within the reach of Jack Ruby. Now, either you or the department would have made to the Bureau to pursue the possible organized crime complicity in the assassination.
Because of the strange shooting of Oswald by Ruby, and because of allegations of organized crime connections, I would have expected the commission to go into those to whatever depth they thought appropriate in terms of coming to whatever conclusions they came to.
I have a different perspective on Katzenbach after hearing his HSCA interviews. It just seems like a lot of information was withheld from the Warren Commission when it came to certain areas and certain aspects. They gave a lot. The FBI, I mean, it's hard because they admitted that they gave them information, but if they're like, for instance, if there was a file about Oswald's intelligence background, they'd give them a file with a summary of Oswald's intelligence background, but they'd have to request, can you give me more information on this certain area? And the FBI would give it to them, but they never requested and they never made that extra step. In my opinion, the Warren Commission shouldn't have had to make that extra step. But that's how the FBI viewed it. We're not going to give them all the information. We're going to give them only what we deem pertinent. And if they need more, they can ask for it. Well, it's like they don't know what they don't know. It's a request for more information on organized crime or Jack Ruby or any of these types of angles. And that's why none of this was reported on, like Katzenbach. I don't think he's lying at all. I just think he thought that the Warren Commission was going to do a proper job in investigating this thing. And clearly the Warren Commission didn't, because they didn't know what else they could be asking for or what else could have been hidden by the FBI or CIA.
Well, it's a little bit of rewriting history by Katzenbach, because he and Hoover and Lyndon Johnson and Earl Warren were all committed to shutting this thing down as quickly as possible. Now, Katzenbach may have been used as a tool, and he may be implicitly saying that, but J. Edgar Hoover was the driving force of the initial objective to shut it down, lone nut, get it done, and he passed that through Katzenbach to Johnson to Warren, and they took that very seriously. If you have to remember, back in the atmosphere of 1963, it was pretty much unthinkable that somebody would have the gall to gun down a president of the United States in front of hundreds of witnesses in broad daylight. I certainly felt like that. It wouldn't have entered my mind that anybody would be that audacious. So the public generally was ready to believe that it was a lone nut. And as I said before, you don't conduct a mafia investigation by going up to a mafia member and saying, "Did you participate in this?" And he says no, and then you walk away and say thank you. That's not how you do it. The HSCA did a better job. They uncovered a lot, and they said the motive means an opportunity for Marcello, Trafficante, and others to have done this. So they believed that they had done it. They didn't have criminal charges to file, so they couldn't actually indict them, but they could say the code words motive means an opportunity to basically say they did that. So they did a better job, but they still were a political committee with a pyramid structure, and that is not the way to conduct a homicide investigation. They didn't have the ability to pressure people and give plea agreements and cut deals like a real investigator would. So even the HSC, as much as they shone the light on this correctly, did not go far enough.
Do you think Oswald would have ratted on the mafia if there was mafia involvement?
Well, I started to get at that because it's my belief, my personal opinion, that when Oswald said during the show and tell at the police headquarters that he was just a patsy, I think that was a huge alarm bell for Carlos Marcello. I think what he meant by that statement was the police are using me a patsy because they don't want to go out and find the real shooter. What Marcello may have heard is I'm just a patsy for somebody else who really is behind this. If Marcello believed that's what he meant, then that took the stalking of Ruby all weekend into high gear. And they felt they had no choice but to do this before he got permanently in jail where they wouldn't have access to him. They had a transfer, probably the last one for a while, and they had to do it then. And of course, they knew it was highly dangerous, and they had to go through the equation and say what is the best option at this point. And they obviously decided we have to silence him because if he says he's a patsy, he may be on the brink of talking. Remember, he may have been a reluctant recruit and really only trying to protect his and his family's life by participating. So once he's in jail, what does his calculus become as far as whether to talk or not to talk?
What was the connection with Jack Ruby and Joe Campisi?
Okay, I think I said George Senator, his roommate, said two of the closest people in the world, Joe Campisi and Ralph Powell, who were partners in business and in the mafia. Joe Campisi was the number two man in the mafia under Carlos Marcello. Number one was Joe Civello. After Joe Civello died, Joe Campisi became the number one man in the mafia. That's in all the documents later on. So, yeah, um, Jack Ruby worked for Joe Campisi. And that's the reason, and probably the main reason, that I feel comfortable in saying that Jack Ruby was involved in the assassination before it happened and in the planning of it, because the most critical time for planning was the night before. And Ruby spent a couple of hours meeting with Joe Campisi. They claim just having dinner, I say making the final plans. And then Ruby went over to the mob hangout Cabana Hotel and met with some of the lower level participants and made the final arrangements there. So no question to me that Jack Ruby was heavily involved in the planning. And give you one other example. The morning of the assassination, before it happened, Ruby told a witness that he was about to come into a lot of money. He was going to get a very expensive apartment in Turtle Creek, one of the richest parts of town in Dallas. This is what's on his mind right before Kennedy's killed, that he's about to come into a lot of money. 2 weeks or so before the assassination, he bought a safe and had it installed in his office. This is a guy who carried thousands around in his pocket. He was about to come into so much money that he could pay off his huge debt to the IRS and buy an expensive apartment, rent an expensive apartment in Turtle Creek. This is all very powerful circumstantial evidence that he was planning in the days and weeks before the assassination. He wasn't just recruited after Tippit was killed to do the hit on Oswald. And to add to that, another person was about to come into a lot of money, according to himself, and that's Lee Harvey Oswald. He's out shopping for cars and getting a driver's license, and he tells somebody that he's about to have enough money to buy a nice car. So Marcello was obviously promising these guys a lot of money. My belief is that this is speculation, but based on logic and circumstances, that when David Ferrie flew him out of Galveston, Oswald, he was going to be landed probably in Mexico, maybe farther south, but probably in Mexico, be seen by a number of people who could give reliable testimony that he was in Mexico alive, and then never be seen again. So whatever Ruby and Oswald were told, they probably wouldn't have lived very long if this had been fully successful.
What you mentioned before about the kind of file 100 hours of tape of Marcello being still sealed away by the government. What do you expect is still can be released with this JFK Act that happens to do with mob related activities in the JFK assassination?
I don't see how they can not release it. Some few transcripts have been released, and Jack Van Landingham was interviewed extensively by Lamar Waldron, the author of Legacy of Secrecy, which has been the movie rights bought by Leonardo DiCaprio. So I recommend Legacy of Secrecy for, I think, about 900 pages of all the mafia stuff with Ruby and Marcello. It's excellent, but disregard the part about the shooting in Dealey Plaza. Go with my findings on that. He basically accepts the public version of that, but other than Dealey Plaza, Lamar Waldron nails the mafia connection in many, many pages of hard documented facts. So, yes, I got off my train of thought there. Where was I headed?
We're talking about the file release. Would it have anything to do with the mafia?
Yeah. I don't see how they can not release those files. Most of the people are dead. At very most, they can cut out parts obviously and clearly unrelated to the assassination. But I mean, according to Van Landingham and FBI reports, Marcello talked very freely and openly about his mob organization, who he worked with, who he paid off, how he got things done. The public needs to know that, and most certainly as it relates to the JFK assassination. So I'm hoping Larry Schnapp and others will be successful, and the new order releasing all the documents will actually take place. And for once, we can have somebody listen to these hundreds of hours and pull out the nuggets for us.
If you haven't listened to this episode, or if you just listen to this episode and you want to know more about John Orr, you can listen to his first episode where he goes into his simulation and everything that he did to track the magic bullet theory, or to look at the single bullet theory and prove his conclusions on it, challenging Dale Meyer's conclusions on his as well too. But also, John Orr, you've given me so much of your time for this episode to talk about the mafia stuff, but there's a lot out there for any new researcher to be looking at, whether it comes into all these independent theories. I use your example all the time where you say it's like the Brothers Grimm's fairy tales. It's better than that. It has the mob figures. It has secret intelligence. It has so much all fingerprinted all throughout the whole JFK case. What would you recommend for new researchers out there that are probably coming across a lot of information, whether it's the Secret Service did it or some other TikTok theory? What would be your recommendation for them on advice on researching? And then also, where can people find you?
The Legacy of Secrecy is an excellent recent source. Lamar Waldron's follow-up book, The Hidden History of the JFK Assassination, includes, in a shorter version, some of the same things, but it updates with some new revelations about what Marcello told Van Landingham. So either or both of those books, but I would go back to when I started. I read two great books about Marcello. One is Mafia Kingfish by John Davis, and the other is Contract on America by David Schein. Both of those are excellent books documenting things that it's unbelievable that the people have not been told this. It's all there. It's all fully documented. Confessions, documents, everything you need to know what the truth is. And yet the American public is woefully ignorant of this. And that's intentional.
Is there a place where people can find your links, John?
At Mountain River Cabins, that's all together, no punctuation, Mountain River Cabins, river singular cabins plural.com/JFK. That has a link to my report and a TV special that I worked on and other things. And by the way, nobody has ever proven, to my knowledge, anything in my report incorrect, to be wrong. But I myself caught several minor errors in my report out of the many hundreds of facts that I had, and I include those on my webpage because the last thing I want to do is perpetuate false or bad information. So when I find an error, I correct it. And to my knowledge, nobody else has found any significant errors in my findings, even to this day.
Well, I appreciate the work that you have done, John. I'm going to link all your links in the description for people to be able to click on. Like I said, if you haven't listened to John's first episode, please go back and listen to that one. And thanks for tuning into this episode. Make sure you like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on another episode of Out of the Blank Podcast.